the computer. Yep. All right. Resume share. Thanks for your patience. All right. So we are going to start with the parable of the Good Samaritan. This text is taken directly from the Fratelli Tutti document, and I thought it would be important tonight to ground us in the parable of the Good Samaritan since it's key to our discussion for tonight. So we'll begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. From the Gospel of Luke. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to that place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." And it's really a great challenge to figure out, what does it mean to go and do likewise? In our Fratelli Tutti series, we are hoping to engage that question of going and doing likewise. I would also ask, before we start, if you can mute your microphones for this first interview portion of the conversation, and then we will have you unmute your microphones when we get into the small group discussion portion of the evening. Now, I want to give an introduction for Dr. Bernie Evans. So, Dr. Bernie Evans, you were very instrumental in my life in terms of being well connected and understanding Catholic social teaching, because I started my own faith journey in high school and in my early years of college very against Catholic social teaching. But I always heard rumors of Dr. Bernie Evans and his Catholic social teaching courses. One of those courses that when I got to grad school, I just had to take his Catholic social teaching course. And so I had always kind of shrugged it off until I actually got to grad school and then became more curious. Like, okay, if he's well known in Catholic social teaching, then I want to learn from him. And what I received from his course was a solid scriptural and intellectual basis to round out my own conversion experience of thinking about how important is Catholic social teaching in my own faith journey. And I really appreciated his scriptural work. That's why Dr. Evans, I chose you specifically for sections 1 and 2, for chapters 1 and 2, because it is the scriptural reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I really just thought you'd be a great voice for this audience. So, yeah, if you want to say anything more to introduce yourself quick, it'd be great. So, Dr. Bernie Evans.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I think that pretty well does it. I was on the faculty at St. John's, mostly in the School of Theology, for 35 years, retired about 3 years ago. And now I started teaching a course on Catholic social teachings yesterday. So they asked me to teach a course, and I was happy to do it, knowing I could just teach and not have to be part of meetings. And that's a real treat. So that's been it. I'm married. My wife died about 1.5 years ago. 2 adult children, and I've just been really blessed to be where I'm at. To have, before coming to St. John's, to have spent 10 years at the National Conference of Catholic Bishops on the first staff of the Catholic, what then was called the Campaign for Human Development, as it was coming into existence. And I was with that for 10 years and then joined the faculty at St. John's. So the Benedictines have been a major influence in my life. And I recognize how blessed I am. I think that should do it for an introduction.
Great. So we're in chapters 1 and 2 of Fratelli, Tutti for what we're talking about tonight. And so if you wanted to give just some opening thoughts as to what was important for you in the text, what stood out, and what would you kind of bring forth as pieces to think about in our discussion tonight?
Well, I think that number one, Adam, thank you for doing this. For having this series, and thank you all for being part of it tonight. I'm just delighted to be part of this, because I think that this is a really important document, extremely timely. The Holy Father, as you know from just having read the first 2 chapters, is addressing a major need in our world right now, and that is how terribly separated we all are, and the need to get back connected as human beings, both within our communities, our societies, and globally. And I just think that overall theme and purpose of the document is extremely important. A couple other things I'd mention, not just regard to these 2 chapters, but his style, as I suspect noticed, is that he includes many things that he has written before. He draws from so many other earlier pieces of writing or talks that he's given. And he does what he does in so many of his other, well, I shouldn't say so many, but his other encyclicals. And that is quotes from other conferences of bishops around the world. I've never seen a pope do it the way he does, but I think it really enriches the message and what he's saying to us. So with what we're talking about tonight, these 2 chapters, very clearly he begins, the first one may seem a little dark, because he's laying out what he sees as the major trends in the world today that are working against the people coming together and having that kind of what he calls fraternal relationships and solidarity around there. That's the first one. And then the second one begins to move out of that and to see where we can go. And I just think that his use of, his reflection upon the parable of the Good Samaritan is just powerful, and just an excellent way to ground what is coming throughout the encyclical. And the whole encyclical is just I think it's just a beautiful work. And I'm very happy to be with the group and be part of a discussion on that.
Yes, and I agree. I think it is a beautiful work. I think the first couple chapters in particular, I'm really connected with his flow. He makes it flow well when he's talking about something really challenging, and then the signs of hope as he does his analysis on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So thinking about our own discourse in America right now. What has changed in the tenor of political discourse over the course of your career? Because you had mentioned in the early 80s, you had started with the Campaign for Human Development and then became theology faculty at St. John's. And Pope Francis spends the first chapter talking about ideologies, control, and fear. Have you seen these changes in our local political discourse, and how has your work changed as the tenor of political discourse has changed?
Well, I think that we all know what some of these changes have been, and they've been coming for the last couple of decades. Probably developed to the maximum during this latest presidential political campaign, which brought to life, if we hadn't noticed it before, the tremendous division and polarization within our country, the kind of separation that really makes it difficult to find common ground, difficult to compromise in the political arena, and as we all know, difficult to get anything done. But I think even beyond that, what it has led to, both nationally and in I think, in at least my local community, a lack of respect for people who have different views or views different from my own. It became much more difficult now, I think, to learn from others' views. There's a tendency to back away or to close ourselves from others who we discover or know to have views that are different from our own. And with that comes, I'm afraid, a growing, well, this may be too strong, but I'll say unwillingness to learn from people with different views. A lack of interest in learning from people with different views, and a tendency among some of us, I think, to not recognize that people who may differ from me are good people, and we should presume they have good intentions, and that they're not evil. But where we are today in our society, I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and makes it all the more difficult for us to come together. And Pope Francis, in this first chapter, I wouldn't say dwells on it, but he certainly develops this point that there are forces out there, or ideologies that tend to control through fear and promoting disagreement and making it very, very difficult, both locally and nationally, for people to move beyond that. And I think we do see this. I certainly do see it somewhat locally, with people uncritically accepting ideologically based claims that do tend to frighten and control populations. And I don't mean in other countries. I mean right here, especially, as Pope Francis would say, by spreading discouragement and despair. And we listen to or we watch CNN, or we watch Fox News, we listen to radio talk shows, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, but there's sources generally, for most of us, we tend to latch onto sources that support our positions. And as Pope Francis pointed out, this tends to create a permanent state of disagreement and confrontation. And I think that runs both at the national, regional, and local level. So you asked about my own work, and has it changed as this has all grown and developed? As I said, I've been on the faculty for 35 years. I think that one thing I would note about changes in my work is that I've over the years come to more and more put a greater focus on the common good. In my writing, in my speaking, and teaching as I have been, always, pardon me, always looking for new and more effective ways to present Catholic social teaching, especially that teaching related to the dignity, to human dignity, the dignity of every human being, whether they agree with me or not, but to put a greater emphasis on that, as well as on the common good as it relates to the larger community. Because I think what we were seeing and experiencing, not just in the United States, but in so many places around the world now, Western Europe particularly, a tendency to focus on self, on our tribes, on our groups, with not enough attention given to the larger community, to the common good.
Yeah, and it's really, I love the idea of the common good and how well Pope Francis highlights it in Fratelli Tutti, and I also appreciate that movement toward the common good of how do we provide a dignified and promote the human dignity of each person in our own lives. It's difficult, and I commend you for having a commitment to that in your work. So moving a little bit forward here, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis mentions a lot of ways in which we've lost our capacity to listen. How does Pope Francis propose a remedy, and where do you see hope given your own work?
Well, yeah, he does. He really talks about our lost ability or capability to listen, that we remain so absorbed in what we want to hear from the sources that we want to be connected to, that it's difficult to truly listen to other views. And I think to recognize honestly that listening can be difficult, even under the best of circumstances. If you think of how often, or if I think of how often I interrupt people when in a conversation before they're finished, or how often I have my answer to whatever they're saying, or if it's a debate or dialogue, before they're even near finished, that's not really listening. And that's part of what he's pointing to here. But I think what he says, especially that we need to do in terms of regaining a capacity to listen, is to the three things he mentioned, is specifically to be in dialogue, to be in relaxed conversation, and even to be in passionate debate. Nothing wrong with passionate debate, as long as we're able to hear the people with whom we're debating, and to be able to listen to them. But that requires, whether dialoguing or in conversation or debate, that requires that we're in relationships where that is possible. It requires that we are willing to hear the other person. And as Pope Francis pointed out on this particular point, we need to have perseverance and moments of silence and solitude that almost help us train to be better listeners, to be looking for other voices. He also, I think it was on this point where he sees with great hope the people who are risking their lives for others, which are such actions that are such strong witnesses to God's love for everybody. And it's in connection with that he makes that wonderful statement that no one is saved alone. It's a statement he makes at least 3 or 4 times throughout the entire document. Here in this very section, in this chapter, he makes the point that no one is saved alone, especially with reference to the pandemic. But I couldn't help but connect his statement here, to a statement that was made by the Second Vatican Council way back in 1965 in their document, The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, where they stated that it has pleased God to make us holy and to save us, not as individuals without any mutual connections to one another, but to save us as a people. Think about that. We are saved together. We are saved as a people. We go to God together. And his use of that phrase in this chapter and throughout the document just keeps bringing back that notion that not only do we need one another to get out of, to survive and manage this pandemic, but in a religious theological sense, we need one another in our journeys to God. And I find that just very powerful. My own hope is rooted in that. I guess I'd call it kind of a religious or theological belief that people are good, that people are more good than we are bad, that we're more inclined to be good Samaritans than we are inclined to be the priest or the Levite that walks by the person who is in need, who is hurting. I really do believe that. And I think another source for my hope in all this would be the just young people, both the very young, like my granddaughters, who have not yet been socially conditioned to dislike and hate and discriminate against other people, but also young people like the young adults in the classroom that I'm around and have been around for so many years, that they do not settle for living in fear and accepting despair and discouragement and the racism that is so much a part of our culture and of our society. And to me, to be around such persons is just a wonderful, energizing source of hope for me.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, when I'm around young adults as well, like, I get a lot of energy and a lot of hope just seeing how much they care about other people and how much that they're willing to sacrifice and just be present. I've learned a lot about listening from engaging even my intern last summer. So, question for me that kind of sticks out in this section of, because we talk about having differences, and how do we in our own conscience think about what are the pieces that are either not negotiable or things that are deeply held values, and areas where we could have disagreement, because I think that discussion's been kind of tight and tense if you look at Catholic Twitter and look at like other sources. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how do we form our conscience, hold fast to our beliefs, but leave room for dialogue with the other. That's where I was trying to get to.
That's a good question. Well, I think, in the Catholic moral tradition, forming our consciences, especially around difficult issues that we may be troubled by, always calls on us to turn to other sources, turn to the scriptures, turn to our church's teachings, but turn to other people as well, and to hear, hopefully to gather the wisdom from other people who may be around us, people who may not agree with us, people who may agree with us, but to be open to hearing what some others, including the scriptures and our church's teachings, might tell us that would cause us to think differently about our own positions. I don't think that means that we necessarily back off of our positions without critical thought going into it. I think that it is important to know where we stand, why we stand on whatever the issue is, but also to know where that is within our religious faith tradition. And sometimes it does take friends or relatives or somebody else to point out to us that there may be a need for us to rethink where we are on this issue.
Yeah. And Pope Francis has talked about conversion at several in Laudato Si. He talks about ecological conversion, and Fratelli Tutti talks about the social conversion. So I think that is just that important disposition to have, is that we can have our principles and our values, but we also have to be willing to engage the experience of others, because we might be wrong. There's a whole set of realities that we're not completely aware of. So I like that. I like that answer, and I appreciate the depth you took with that question. So now to the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I mean, your Catholic social teaching book, Lazarus at the Table, and the idea of just using scripture to engage the centrality of social issues. So how does the parable of the Good Samaritan invite us to stretch ourselves and help us reflect about how we are present to others in need?
Sure. Well, the parable of the Good Samaritan is a call to love our neighbor in the broadest possible way of saying that. But it's challenging in many ways, because to love our neighbor is, we always hear that. We know that's the characteristic mark of a Christian, or should be. and Jesus commanded that. But the parable of the Good Samaritan reminds us that this is a love of our neighbor is to be expressed in concrete actions. And we receive a very vivid description of how concrete and what that looks like in this parable. It's a challenging also because with Christ, the neighbor now means all humans. During his time and in the Hebrew culture, it was understood in a much more restricted manner to one's own nation or one's own people or tribe or whatever. But with Christ, it's absolutely opened up to everybody. And love does not, as Pope Francis stated, love does not care if the person in need is from one place or another. It simply responds without asking. And it calls on us to help people in need whenever and wherever we can. And that means, I think, especially locally. And for example, staying with the image of the Good Samaritan, immigrants in our communities, so often in need of support, in need of assistance, would be a good example. And I go back to reminded of Pope Benedict XVI's encyclical, one of his encyclicals, where he makes the point that the neighbor is anybody whom we are in a position to help. And I think that also is a way of expressing how universal the notion of neighbor is now, especially with the Good Samaritan. And two other things I mentioned. The parable of the Good Samaritan, as Pope Francis points out, reminds us to not just write out a check or bring a bag of groceries to the food shelf, but to give our time, to spend time, as did the Good Samaritan, to go out of our way, to break our schedule if we need to realize that what I may have been planning to do today may not have been as important as responding to this person in pain or in some other kind of need right now. He calls us to emerge from our comfortable isolation and spend time with the ones who are hurting, to spend time with them. And he adds that life is a time for interactions. I love that way of putting it, especially with people who are hurting and people whom we are in a position to help. Interact, give some time, especially I think for most of us in this society, we're so busy and so scheduled that it can be a real challenge coming out of this parable to think about being willing to break that schedule and give time. And the other thing, the last thing I'd mention in terms of challenges being stretched by this parable is to allow ourselves to be changed by our contact with human suffering, by our contact with people who have needs and to whom we're responding. I think of the nurses and other frontline workers who have been risking their lives in this pandemic. And I think especially of the nurses who have been holding the hands of COVID patients who are dying without family members. And I imagine what a powerful experience this must be on those nurses and how it has to affect them and probably do so, it will so for the rest of their lives. And I'm not sure if this is right, but it does seem to me that that's a kind of example of what Pope Francis is talking about. Allow ourselves to be changed by human suffering, by the people to whom we're reaching out in support or to provide assistance. So when we are the Good Samaritan, when we are acting as the Good Samaritan, what we do for the other person is important. I don't question that at all, but it's also terribly important what happens to us as we're doing that, as we act in love, in service, or in some form of justice on behalf of others. I don't think we should overlook that it is about helping another person, but as Pope Francis is pointing out in this section, it's also about letting ourselves be changed, or the word you used earlier, Adam, to be converted in one way or another here.
Yeah. And it's so important to think about time. I really like that image of time, that we give our time as well as any material or financial piece that we might give. I think that's something that we can all be challenged and grow into as we think about social ministry in the context of our archdiocese, or social ministry in the context of the country we're in now, is that we need just more time. I will say I've gotten very bad at the giving time piece. It's not been a piece I've been very good at, because I got my schedule, I got to get to the meetings, I got to do the service, but there are times where I need to be able to take a step back and like, nope, we have a problem here. I need to go deal with this. Or, so it's a good reminder, and it's so important. And it's something I really kind of want to make sure I'm pondering in my own actions with the people I interact with, that I really make time for them, because we need less human suffering. And if we can give time and dignity for people, no matter their state, then I think we go a long way to looking at the image of what Fratelli Tutti is about.
I would just add quickly that we were given a warning about this for a couple of decades ago. And that is that as Americans, we're tending in the direction of not giving people time, or not wanting to spend a lot of time with people. I'm thinking of the book, I forget the author's name, I think from Yale University, but the book is Bowling Alone, in which he develops the argument, the case that Americans more and more are doing things not as groups, but as individuals. And the bowling piece was more and more Americans are bowling, but they're not bowling in leagues, on teams. They're just bowling alone. They're not spending time with others. Same with charitable organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got about 10 minutes left in in the interview process. So Pope Francis talks about the importance of the integration of fraternity into our worship and our catechesis. What practices have you seen, and what would you recommend for our archdiocese in helping us move forward to integrate more fraternity and social charity into our worship and catechesis?
Well, I want to be careful here because I'm not as familiar as some of you are with the archdiocesan practices here in worship and in catechesis. But rather generally, speaking fairly generally, number one is to recognize that the worship is just absolutely central to our formation as a faith community and as disciples of Jesus Christ. It's absolutely central. I want to begin with that. As I move to what Pope Francis does say about it, though, and with the parable, where he points out that the priest and the Levite pass by the bruised and bleeding victim lying in the ditch. And they were religious people, and they were devoted to the worship of God. But he points out also that, but belief in God and worship of God is not enough. Worship, liturgy must lead to acts of love, especially towards neighbors in need. I think we have to be so absolutely clear on that before we think about or talk about what specific things we can do or must do better. But to recognize that when we're given the dismissal at the end of the Eucharistic celebration, the Mass is ended, go in peace. Sometimes different phrases are used. It is to go out into the world and change whatever contradicts what we have just celebrated. And what we have just celebrated is the presence of Christ in our community. We have just celebrated, given thanks for the fact that everything has changed and that our relationship with God has been reestablished. Our relationship with one another has been reestablished. And anything that contradicts that is what we need to address when we leave this liturgy. So I think that, and that's what we know, the scriptures, especially Isaiah, Amos, I hate, I despise your worship, I will not listen to your music, etc. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-present stream. Our scriptures are constantly filled with that. And so it needs to be overall that what Pope Francis is talking about here, there needs to be a deeply rooted awareness of and commitment to making a connection between liturgy and justice in our lives. That's a given. How do we do it? How do we help worshipers move from the act of from the liturgy, from worship to acts of love and justice, the first thing I would say is to recognize what is already present in the liturgy. We don't need to manipulate the liturgy or worship service. We don't need to bring in stuff that doesn't belong there, but to recognize that what is already present in our readings, in our prayers, in the petitions, in our songs, how much all of that already calls us to respond to the person in the ditch. It's there. We, I think, don't give enough attention to that. And I don't know if not sure if I'm recommending here that we do more catechesis on this very thing, but to pay attention to what's in the Eucharistic prayers and what they call for in terms of caring for creation. All of it. Our Eucharistic liturgies are just rich in calls for justice. So I think that's the starting point. How do we offer handles to people from worship, going from worship? I think one way might be to, within the liturgy, to recognize, to work those organizations, programs that are working with people in need locally. Help people in the worshiping, coming to the worshiping event, to the celebration, to recognize what are some of the needs in our community. And there are ways to do that in the liturgy, through the petitions, through the prayers of the faithful. Pope Francis is always, in not just this encyclical, but always telling us to be concrete. Don't leave it all in the abstract, but be concrete. And I think this would be a place and a time, an occasion where it would make sense to be concrete and find creative ways to let people hear of needs in the community. And this does not have to be controversial one bit. And this can be done in preaching as well. Pope Francis, in this section, said that both the preaching and catechesis, religious education, should, and I'm quoting him now, speak more directly about the social implications of the gospel and about the fraternal dimension of spirituality. And that fraternal dimension of spirituality is, again, connected to that notion that we're not saved alone. My spirituality is connected to yours. My journey to God is connected to yours. Our liturgies need to help us experience that as well. I know I'm not being very concrete on that, but I just think that those are just some things that we can do. And also with the catechesis part of it, there I think that the more we can connect people, and here I'm talking about at every level, from children up through adult education, connect parishioners with people or groups in the community that have needs, the more we have a chance of making this happen. I just remember so well when I worked with many years ago, I know decades ago, the Campaign for Human Development and the efforts we made to connect parishes around the country with the projects that we were funding in their geographical area. And what a powerful educational moment that could be. And I think we need to find new, creative, and practical ways to do that, both in our liturgy and in our catechetical programs.
That's very. You say it's not. You said it wasn't practical, but I think you really got to the key principles of what we're looking for when we're thinking about how do we integrate this into our worship and our catechesis. I think it's a very good starting ground. And the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, we have wonderful groups all around the Twin Cities and even in some of the rural parts of the diocese where there are plenty of experiences that we can work with the groups to create in terms of providing that educational experiential piece, that encounter, like the education by encounter that Pope Francis suggests, I think is such a vital part of our just discernment and knowledge going forward. And so right now I want to thank you for the first part of this conversation and having this interview with me. I think this was a great honor to be able to ask you to do this interview, and I'm glad you said yes, and just been a great conversation. And I'm seeing some hands of applause come in on the Zoom chat, so that's really great. So now what I'm going to do in terms of this conversation is that we're going to move into small groups now. And so Bernie, or Dr. Evans, you have agreed to be in a breakout room, so I'm going to send you out in the breakout room when we go forward with that. If you do not get an invitation to the breakout room, it means you'll be in my breakout room here, and we got a few small group questions for us to discuss. So if you guys can turn your mics on when you get into your small group session, that would be wonderful. I'm also going to pause the recording for the small group session, so we will be back. Oh, yes.
Can I ask? This is so basic, but how do I get into a group?
I am putting you into a group right now.
Thank you. Okay.
Yep. So you'll get an invitation on your screen to go into a breakout room. I'm going to set the timer for about 21 minutes by the time I'm done with that. That'll get us to about 8:10, and then we'll come back for a large group Q&A session with Dr. Bernie Evans.
Okay.
All right. So off we go. We want to end the meeting though. Oh. Am I still here? Am I still here?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. So I thought I disappeared for a second because I was starting to ask a question and then my computer decided to freeze and I'm like, no, don't do that. So Dr. Evans, in Fratelli Tutti, we really hear a lot about just the need for community. How do you see the digital age affecting community, and what is the experience of the young adults you have and their embrace of digital community in the midst of the pandemic?
Well, because of the digital, what's available to us, namely Zoom, more than half of the students are able to stay away and take the class. About 6 of them are from other countries. So, I mean, I say that because they're deeply appreciative of the good things that this digital age, if that's what it's called, can offer. And these are mature people, young men and women who have a few seminarians, Benedictine seminarians in there, but mostly lay men and women who have chosen to go in this direction, to get an advanced degree in theology, one area of theology or another. And in some cases meaning that they've left a different career behind. So looking at them, they are very, very appreciative of what it offers. And I feel so solidly comfortable with where they're at on that it's quite the contrast from what Pope Francis was talking about at different points in these 2 chapters about the digital age and what it can do, how the social media forms that we utilize oftentimes are great ways to put us in touch with people, but how did he say it? I'm trying to remember, but they don't develop relationships or they don't develop friendship. And sometimes, maybe too often, we don't even recognize that, but that we're so massively connected through the different social media entities that we just don't always recognize that the deeply human relationships that we need and have to have in our lives are not being fostered through these platforms. And here I would think more of in terms of students, when I used to teach on a more regular basis, I was always struck by, at the very end of class, and here I'm talking about undergraduate students, how those smartphones would just be whipped out before they're out of the classroom. And they're walking with a friend, a buddy from class, but they're talking to somebody else on the phone. And that image has just always stayed with me, and I'm not sure what to make of it other than that what Pope Francis was observing here, that well connected, but not terribly well related in terms of relationships.
and it's interesting being kind of a bit more of a digital native, just being younger myself. I do have friends that are very close friends that I've only met through like Twitter or through social media, but that's still there is a nice. I think if there's a place where we can have a respect for the importance of in-person conversation, but also see that there might be some different and unique circumstances that allow for digital friendship. And it's good that your classroom you've made it work out so that so many students can be in a hybrid model and make that work too. So,
and believe me, I'm not the one to be critiquing social media. I use a smartphone and I use a computer, and I pray every time I go on Zoom that I'll stay on Zoom, that it works. I'm not real comfortable in this world.
well, and I was glad that I came back. I didn't think I was going to come back for a second there. So that was, got to keep the technology working. Do we have any questions from the people, from our participants? Any questions for Dr. Bernie Evans? All right, we got a question in the chat from Paul Marincell. In thinking about Fratelli Tutti and the Good Samaritan and the prayers of the faithful, I wonder if we can bring forth in the prayers of the faithful our need for grace and mercy in the face of white supremacy and the threat of violence, which has become undeniable in recent weeks.
I don't know why we can't. Yeah, to include that in the prayers of the faithful, that explicit, that clear, absolutely. I think that's the kind of concrete practicality that Pope Francis is pointing to. And I think that's the kind of thing that I'm suggesting in answer to your much earlier question about what can, say, the diocese, the archdiocese do with worship, with liturgy, to promote what he's talking about in the encyclical. And I do think that if there's something that all of our liturgies, and here I'm not talking about the archdiocese specifically, but especially in the communities I live in, or the community I live in and the parishes I visit, the need to be more concrete, more practical, and to not let it all remain abstract is really important. And that kind of a petition, that kind of a prayer, especially today, given where we're at with this, with the whole issue of racism, of white supremacy, and our need to figure out what we're going to do. And first of all, our need to understand what it is. We need to pray for that. And we should do so publicly as a faith community.
Yeah. That next question from Reba, do you have any suggestions for resources to read or learn more about connecting social justice to liturgy and worship?
Well, I do have a book that was published in the last 6 months. Since you asked, I'm going to mention it. Hold on.
Oh man, this is a treat.
This is Glorify the Lord by Your Life.
Oh.
Subtitle, Catholic Social Teaching and the Liturgy. But I more broadly, in answer to your question, Reba, this is published by LTP, Liturgy Training Publications in Chicago. If I were you, if you want to search for more resources on connecting, was it liturgy and justice that you asked about?
Yep.
Yeah. I would go onto their website. They have quite a number of publications that either relate directly to that topic or that touch on it in different ways, topics of it, parts of it. So I would go to LTP.
All right. And
so I didn't just promote my own book.
Oh, I didn't know the book was out, so otherwise I probably would have plugged the book if I had known it existed. So it's great to hear that. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to adapt a question from Mary's comment here. So, what if you are in an area where a prayer of the faithful, where you're talking directly about white supremacy and having it be so direct? How would you address that in a parish structure where that might be challenged?
Yeah, I do think we have to be careful on that. Language is important, words are important, and if if you were to use that in a small parish in central Stearns County, I don't think it would be well received, maybe not even heard well. I think there are different ways to pray for and to bring to light very difficult issues without just turning people off. And that's what I would fear with that phrase, that terminology. It's sometimes, I mean, St. Joan of Arc, you could probably do it without any problem at all, I suspect, and in many of your parishes, I know you could. But I'm also in a little bit different ecclesial setting, and I know I would, if I had something to say about that, I would be pretty careful about the language that I use, while still trying to, and maybe here is where liturgy and catechesis go together, that we need to do some catechetical work, some education on this.
All right. And this will be the last question. Nick and Madeline, if I see your hand is raised. So,
yeah, so I had a question. I'm going to try and work through it and get to the question, but I think we all know that the central, I don't know if it's a tenet or catechism about the dignity of the human person. And as we're kind of talking about ideologies, people fall politically on the left and the proverbial right. And even in church circles, we have this sense about parishes, if they're conservative or progressive. And so anecdotally, I've seen that you see some groups that coalesce around an issue like pro-life, strictly defined in this sense as like anti-abortion. And then you see other camps that coalesce around an issue like immigration reform, and DACA, things, political legislation or policies like that. And you kind of see them divided. And obviously, both of those things it could be argued, are central to the dignity of the human person. So how do we bring these groups that seem to limit their focus sometimes on life issues to one or the other, and bring them together to see the Catholicness of all the issues, and make sure that our thinking is in agreement with the very basic teaching about the dignity of the human person?
It's a very good, very tough question, though. I think the one thing I would certainly recommend and encourage is to encourage people, whatever issue they're on, to work on it, to be involved in it. I think it's important for all of us to recognize that God gives us different gifts and different interests and passions that lead us to focus on some challenges, some issues more than others. And I don't think I think that's a good thing. I really think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for us and for our church. It reminds me of St. Paul writing that there are many gifts from the Holy Spirit, and they're all for the building up of the church. So I would say that we need to try to find ways to make both groups, or the many different groups that are working on different issues, feel comfortable with what they're doing. But then the struggle is to also try to help all of them, and that might come through religious education and through preaching, to realize that there's more than what they themselves are focused on. Not that it's wrong for them to be focused on one, but to be open to see the connection between, quote unquote, their issue and another issue, and that perhaps we need to see that the bottom connecting line to all of them is the dignity of the human person, and to help people see that what a powerful, tremendous teaching that is in our religious tradition. And to me, it seems that that's a healthy way to both support people where they're at, to encourage people to get into it where they are, and but also don't just be stuck there if we can go beyond, because we can go beyond.
Right. And I think that's all the time we have for this evening. I want to thank Dr. Bernie Evans for coming to be a part of this conversation with us. And this is part 1 of 5 for our Fratelli Tutti monthly series. And so we will be having our next conversation on Wednesday, February 24th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. And that will be with Catherine Orr, who is the executive director of the Catholic Roundtable of Social Action Directors. And so that will be on chapter 3 of Fratelli Tutti. If you're reading Fratelli Tutti, to be ahead. Again, the reading is not required. We'll try to keep the conversation connected to the points of the dialogue that we have in the midst of the interview. If you have any questions about the series, or if you want to get the Google registration link to register for future sessions, please email me. My email address at the Archdiocese or at the Center for Mission is I'll just put it in the chat because it's a long email address.
Thank you all.
Yep.
Very much appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.